Simon Johnson warned of the dangers of too big to fail in his last book, 13 Bankers. I talked to him earlier and started by asking him if larger, better capitalized banks are making the situation any safer now.
No. With regard to the U.S. and global financial system, we are facing absolutely the same kinds of dangers we faced in 2007. Of course, we're in a different part of the cycle. The banks are still being a little bit careful, but in terms of the structure of the problem and the nature of the too big to fail issues, these are just as bad as they were before that previous crisis.
When we look at the numbers, they're shocking in terms of how much bigger, in fact, the overall banking system has become. In part, though, is that not because we've asked them to get bigger by capitalizing so heavily, that they look bigger because they have much more capital on their balance sheets, and therefore they are themselves safer?
No, the increase in size is mostly about their total assets. They remain very highly leveraged, a lot of assets relative to their equity base, their equity funding. It's true that they have raised some equity relative to where they were in 2007, but that equity is still nowhere near enough. For example, if you want the U.S. banks to be safe, facing all kinds of shocks coming our way from the Eurozone, we do not have enough capital, enough equity financing in our biggest banks.
Meanwhile, and this is the subject of your latest book, is Barack Obama in a position to actually deal with that problem today? Does he have the political capital? Does he have the wherewithal to try to make the banking system safer?
Well, this administration unfortunately missed the opportunity to make big progress on the banking front in early 2009 during the crisis. The Dodd-Frank financial reforms, which passed in 2010, have some pieces that could be helpful. It's a long struggle. The banks are fighting back hard. The power of the special lobby and the power of money in American politics is almost overwhelming. So it's going to be very difficult for this administration. And of course, the Republicans have promised, if they come to power after November, to repeal entirely Dodd-Frank. So that would not be particularly helpful either.
It's all happening, of course, in the context of pretty serious fiscal problems of its own, the U.S. government. You point out that there will be the possibility of a change, at least in the executive branch. Does any of that matter? Is that going to be a meaningful difference to how and whether and in what way America tackles its debt problems?
Oh, absolutely. I think this November election is one of the most critical with regard to whether it can bring its fiscal house into order and how it goes about doing that. The Bush-era tax cuts expire at the end of this year. If they're allowed to expire, that's a large movement in income tax rates in particular, also capital gains, also dividends, also perhaps estate tax. And that could be a substantial step in the right direction. If it's handled in a responsible way, if it's handled with enough support in Congress, it would be very positive over the 5 to 10 year time horizon that we should be looking at. If it's mishandled, if there's more deadlock, if there is irresponsible tax cutting in the face of these large deficits and the increase in debt relative to the size of the economy, that is trouble for the United States and for the world economy going forward.
Is there not, though, deadlock ahead, almost regardless of what happens in November?
Well, the very interesting thing, Amanda, about the Bush tax cuts is that if there's deadlock and they can't agree on what to do, then those tax cuts expire. In fact, it's the only thing on the fiscal horizon where deadlock will actually give you fiscal adjustment, meaning a movement towards a smaller budget deficit and more controlled debt. So it does depend on how it plays out. You have to be careful. Depending on how the economy is recovering at that stage. You might need to replace the Bush-era tax cuts with a temporary payroll tax cut, for example, linked to employment relative to total population. So as employment increases and recovers, that tax cut would fade away. But this absolutely can be handled, and there is a somewhat unusual political opportunity presenting itself with regard to reestablishing fiscal responsibility in the United States at the end of this year.
And I guess one of the things you want to do with your book is alert Americans to this, that it's not some dry subject that doesn't concern them, it actually does deeply. Will it become polarized? Because the politics in America have seemed more in the last few years than one remembers. So can it actually be resolved in a way that engages the citizenry and actually moves forward in a healthy fashion?
Well, obviously, American politics is highly polarized around a number of issues, including taxation and the role of the government. But one reason we wrote the book was to take people back in history and really show them how the Republic has handled fiscal problems in the past. And the title of the book, White House Burning, is a reference to the War of 1812, when the Americans very badly mismanaged their fiscal affairs and faced severe setbacks, including the burning of Washington by the British, and some people say by the Canadians as well. The White House was burned because the U.S. had not provided the resources to finance what they wanted the government to do, which in that case was all about national defense.
That's sort of the underpinning of all of this is this notion that America may have lost its greatness, that its time has passed, that China is ascending, that developing markets are the place to look. Does America still have a shot at getting its house in order and being the great nation it's been?
Yes, absolutely. This country has been through repeated crises. It's been through a lot of stress around the fiscal side of the economy also. This situation, without doubt, is serious. It is somewhat more complex because you face not only the inherited deficits from the Bush tax cuts, the 2 foreign wars, and the financial crisis, you also have the lack of control over healthcare spending going forward. But the Americans absolutely can deal with this. Winston Churchill said, actually, his mother, remember, was an American. He said, the Americans always do the right thing after first exhausting all the other possibilities.
A great quote. We've got to leave it there, Simon. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks a lot.
Simon Johnson, co-author of White House Burning, The Founding Fathers, Our National Why It Matters to You. Now it's time to zip around.